In 1958, the Ford Motor Company launched what they believed would be their masterpiece, their ticket to dominating the medium-price automobile market. They called it the Edsel. What followed was not triumph, but one of the most spectacular, most expensive, and most talked-about failures in the entire history of American business. Ford lost $350 million on this project. To put that in perspective, adjusting for inflation, that's roughly $3 billion in today's money. $3 billion? Gone. But here's the thing that makes this story even more remarkable. Ford conducted virtually zero meaningful market research before committing hundreds of millions of dollars to this venture. They didn't ask consumers what they wanted. They didn't test whether people would actually buy this car. They simply assumed, with the arrogance that only a giant corporation of the 1950s could muster, that if they built it, Americans would come running with their checkbooks open. Let me take you back to the mid-1950s, when this disaster was first conceived. Ford Motor Company was doing exceptionally well. They had their entry-level Ford brand, and they had their luxury Lincoln brand. But there was this massive gap in between. This middle market where General Motors was absolutely dominating with Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Buick. Chrysler had DeSoto and Dodge sitting right there too. Ford looked at all those sales they were missing and decided they needed a completely new brand, a completely new division, to capture that market. The company began development in 1955. They assembled teams of designers, engineers, and executives. They spent months, then years, working on this new automobile. And here's where the first critical mistake happened. Instead of starting with consumer research, instead of asking Americans what they wanted in a medium-priced car, Ford started with internal committees and corporate politics. Different executives pushed their own visions. Designers created what they thought looked good. Engineers added features they found interesting. But nobody stopped to ask the most important question: what do actual car buyers want? The car was named after Edsel Ford, Henry Ford's son, who had passed away in 1943. It was meant to be a tribute, a memorial to a man who had been instrumental in Ford's success. The name itself became controversial. Some people found it odd-sounding, difficult to pronounce, or simply unappealing. But Ford pressed ahead. They had invested too much to turn back now. Now let's talk about that grille. Oh, that infamous grille. When the Edsel was finally revealed to the public on September 4, 1957, people were shocked by the front-end design. The vertical grille, which Ford called a horse-collar design, dominated the front of the car. It was unlike anything else on American roads. Ford thought this would make the Edsel instantly recognizable, a distinctive brand identity. What they didn't anticipate was the public mockery that would follow. Critics immediately started making jokes. Some said it looked like a horse collar, yes, but not in a good way. Others said it resembled a toilet seat. The more vulgar comparisons I won't repeat here, but let's just say people found the oval vertical opening to be suggestive of, shall we say, less flattering imagery. Late-night comedians had a field day. Magazine writers piled on. And in the court of public opinion, the Edsel's design was quickly becoming a punchline rather than a selling point. But the grille wasn't the only problem. The entire styling of the Edsel was, frankly, confused. The car had odd proportions. The rear end didn't match the front end's aggressive verticality. The side panels featured strange sculptural elements that seemed to fight against each other rather than creating a cohesive whole. If you compare this to the elegant flowing designs that were coming from General Motors styling studios under the legendary Harley Earl, the Edsel looked like it had been designed by a committee that never quite agreed on a direction. Which, in fact, is exactly what happened. Inside the car, Ford tried to impress buyers with innovation. The dashboard featured a Teletouch transmission system, where you selected gears by pushing buttons in the center of the steering wheel. This was supposed to be futuristic, modern, push-button motoring for the space age. In reality, it was a mechanical nightmare. The system was complex, prone to failure, and confusing for drivers. People would accidentally hit the wrong button. The mechanisms would jam. Repairs were expensive and frequent. What was meant to be a selling point became another reason to avoid the Edsel. The car also featured automatic lubrication systems, self-adjusting brakes, and other innovations that sounded impressive in brochures but proved problematic in actual use. Quality control was atrocious. Early Edsels came off the assembly line with numerous defects. Paint was uneven. Trim pieces fell off. Oil leaks were common. The cars spent more time in dealer service bays being fixed than they did on the roads being enjoyed. Ford's timing couldn't have been worse. The Edsel launched in September 1957, just as the American economy was sliding into the recession of 1958. This economic downturn hit the automobile industry particularly hard. Suddenly, Americans weren't looking for flashy, expensive, medium-priced cars loaded with gadgets. They wanted practical, economical transportation. They wanted cars that were cheap to buy and cheap to run. And what was selling during this recession? The Volkswagen Beetle, a small, simple, reliable, affordable car from Germany. It was the complete opposite of the Edsel. While Ford was trying to sell a car that cost between $2,500 and $4,000, depending on the model and options, Volkswagen was selling Beetles for around $1,800. The Beetle got excellent fuel economy. It was easy to maintain. It didn't have complicated push-button transmissions or elaborate grilles. It was honest, straightforward transportation. The American public was also beginning to shift their tastes. The excesses of 1950s automotive design were starting to feel dated. Those enormous tail fins, those massive chrome bumpers, those overstyled bodies, they were going out of fashion. The Edsel represented the peak of 50s excess right at the moment when people were starting to want something different, something cleaner, something more modern. Ford's marketing department tried desperately to save the Edsel. They spent enormous sums on advertising. Television commercials showed the Edsel in the best possible light. Print ads filled magazines and newspapers. Dealerships held special events. Ford even convinced some celebrities to be photographed with Edsels. But none of it worked. You cannot market your way out of a fundamentally flawed product that nobody wants. The sales numbers tell the brutal story. Ford had projected they would sell at least 200,000 Edsels in the first year. They built an entire dealer network based on this projection. They tooled factories for this production volume. In the end, they sold fewer than 65,000 units in the 1958 model year. 65,000. Less than one-third of their target. The second year was even worse. In 1959, Edsel sales dropped to around 45,000 units. Ford desperately tried to redesign the car to address the criticisms. The 1959 Edsel had a less controversial grille, more conventional styling, and fewer problematic features. But it was too late. The Edsel name was already synonymous with failure. The brand was poisoned. Nobody wanted to be seen driving the most famous automotive flop in American history. By 1960, Ford gave up. They announced that the Edsel division would be discontinued. The 1960 model year saw only about 3,000 Edsels built before Ford pulled the plug entirely. Less than 3 years from launch to cancellation. An entire brand, an entire division, hundreds of millions of dollars, thousands of workers' jobs, all gone. The dealerships that had invested their own money in Edsel franchises were left stranded. They had built showrooms, hired salespeople, trained mechanics, stocked parts inventories. Many went bankrupt. The Edsel didn't just hurt Ford, It devastated an entire ecosystem of small businesses that had believed in Ford's promises. What went wrong? Everything. But if we have to identify the core failure, it was the complete absence of market research. Ford built a car based on what they thought people should want, not what people actually wanted. They created a brand based on internal corporate logic, not consumer desire. They launched at exactly the wrong moment in the economic cycle. They designed a car that became a joke. They implemented technologies that didn't work properly. They targeted a market segment that was already overcrowded and about to shrink. There's a famous story from the Edsel's development that perfectly encapsulates the problems. Ford hired a poet named Marianne Moore to help name the car. She suggested names like Resilient Bullet, Mongoose Civique, and Utopian Turtletop. Ford rejected all of these, which, to be fair, was probably the right decision. But here's the thing. They were asking a poet for car names instead of asking potential customers what would appeal to them. That tells you everything you need to know about Ford's approach to this project. The Edsel also became a cultural phenomenon beyond just automotive history. It became a symbol, a metaphor for corporate hubris, for marketing failure, for the dangers of ignoring your customers. Business schools still teach the Edsel case study today. The phrase, "it's an Edsel," entered American language as shorthand for an expensive, high-profile flop. Interestingly, in the years after production ended, the Edsel developed a cult following among collectors. Because so few were made, and because so many were scrapped in embarrassment, surviving Edsels became relatively rare. That infamous horse-collar grille that had been mocked in 1958 started to be appreciated by collectors in the 1970s and 80s as a unique example of 50s automotive design. Today, a well-preserved Edsel can fetch decent money at auction, not in spite of its failure, but because of it. The car's historical significance as the industry's most famous disaster makes it valuable. Ford learned valuable lessons from the Edsel debacle, though those lessons came at an enormous cost. In the early 1960s, when they developed the Mustang, they took the complete opposite approach. They did extensive market research. They tested prototypes with real consumers. They priced it competitively. They launched it when the economy was strong, and the baby boom generation was coming of age and looking for sporty cars. The Mustang became one of the most successful automotive launches in history, selling over 400,000 units in its first year and creating an entirely new market segment, the pony car. The contrast between the Edsel and the Mustang shows what happens when a company listens to its customers versus when it doesn't. The Edsel was designed in boardrooms by executives who thought they knew better than the market. The Mustang was designed with constant feedback from potential buyers, with an understanding of what young Americans wanted in a car. Looking back from our perspective in 2026, the Edsel disaster seems almost quaint. $350 million sounds like a lot, and it was in 1958 terms. But modern automotive failures can cost far more. Development costs for new vehicles today can exceed $1 billion even for successful models. The difference is that modern car companies do extensive research, testing, and validation before launch. They learned from disasters like the Edsel. The Edsel also represents a specific moment in American automotive history that can never be repeated. The 1950s were a unique time of post-war prosperity, cheap gasoline, and automotive excess. American manufacturers thought they could do no wrong, that Americans would buy whatever Detroit decided to build. The Edsel shattered that illusion. It proved that even the mighty Ford Motor Company could fail spectacularly if they ignored market realities. There's something almost tragic about the Edsel story. Thousands of people worked hard on this car. Engineers solved complex technical problems. Designers spent months perfecting curves and proportions. Factory workers assembled these vehicles with care. Dealers invested their life savings in franchises. All of that effort, all of that investment, all of those hopes and dreams ultimately came to nothing because the fundamental premise was flawed from the beginning. The Edsel stands as a monument to the importance of market research, customer focus, and timing in business. It reminds us that success in the marketplace cannot be manufactured through clever advertising or corporate willpower alone. You have to give people what they want, when they want it, at a price they're willing to pay, with quality they can depend on. Ford failed on every single one of those dimensions with the Edsel. And yet, paradoxically, the Edsel's failure made it immortal. If it had been a modest success, selling 50,000 units a year for a decade, nobody would remember it today. It would be a footnote in automotive history, another obscure brand that came and went. But because it failed so spectacularly, so publicly, so expensively, it became unforgettable. The Edsel will be remembered long after many successful cars of its era have been forgotten. So the next time you see that vertical horse-collar grille on a restored Edsel at a car show, take a moment to appreciate what you're looking at. It's not just a quirky old car. It's a $350 million lesson in how not to develop and market a product. It's a reminder that even the biggest companies can fail if they lose touch with their customers. It's automotive history's most expensive, most famous, and most enduring disaster. And in its own strange way, that makes it absolutely fascinating.